Welcome to the Humanitarian Supply Chain Podcast, the first and only show that actually compares humanitarian aid and private sector supply chains using real cases, real field experience, and the kind of stories you'll never hear in a boardroom. If you are here for honest insights, field stories, and a few laughs at the beautiful mess we call supply chain, hit subscribe, keep listening, and leave a comment. Let's get started. Imagine waking up in a city that never sleeps. The streets are alive with the hum of delivery trucks, the aroma of fresh coffee, and the buzz of smartphones connecting people across continents. Now imagine waking up in a place where the world has just turned upside down, a city shaken by an earthquake, roads crumbled, and hope hanging by the thread. Two worlds, two legislations, both racing against time. One is tracking sneakers and smartphones. The other is fighting to deliver food and medicines where every minute could mean the difference between life and death. Welcome to the Humanitarian Supply Chain Podcast. I'm your host, Irina Lukyanova, and today we are diving deep into the fascinating and sometimes chaotic realities of supply chains. Not just the ones that keep your favorite gadgets on the shelf, but the ones that save lives when disaster strikes. What happens when this world collide? What can they learn from each other? And how do we build a future where speed, fairness, and resilience go hand in hand? Let's step into these two worlds together. Let's start with a simple truth. Supply chains are the lifeblood of our modern world. The invisible networks that make sure your morning coffee is waiting for you, your medicine is at the pharmacy, and in times of crisis, that life-saving aid reaches those who need it most. But what happens when these networks are disrupted? When a pandemic closes borders, when a hurricane destroys infrastructure, or when war displaces millions overnight? The answer depends on the kind of supply chain you are running, humanitarian or private sector. So picture this, you are in the middle of an earthquake zone or maybe a war-torn city. The humanitarian supply chain is all about saving lives and easing suffering. It's messy, unpredictable, and sometimes feels like you are building the plane as you're flying it. Demand? It's all over the place. One minute you need blankets, the next it's medicine or clean water. Infrastructure? Sometimes it's barely there. And funding? You're constantly chasing donors and grants, hoping the money comes through before the next crisis hits. The stakes? They couldn't be higher. We're talking about real people lives. Now, flip the script. In the private sector, it's a whole different ballgame. The mission here is to be efficient, profitable, and keep customers smiling. Everything's planned out. Predictable demand, loads of data, and shiny technology. Funding isn't a nail biter. It's steady thanks to revenue rolling in. Infrastructure. Think warehouses with robots, trucks with GPS, and systems that hum along. The stakes? Sure, they're big. Market share, profits, reputation, but it's a different kind of pressure. Let's put this side by side just to see how they stack. Primary goal for humanitarian supply chain is to save lives. For private sector supply chain is to maximize efficiency and profitability. Demand pattern. Humanitarian supply chain face highly unpredictable, disaster-driven demand. Private sector supply chains rely on forecastable trends. Funding model. Humanitarian supply chains depend on donations, grants, and donor generosity. Private sector supply chains are revenue driven with stable resources. Infrastructure. Humanitarian supply chains often operate where infrastructure is damaged or absent. Private sector supply chains enjoy well developed, advanced infrastructure. Technology use. In humanitarian supply chains, technology is limited. If you're lucky, you might have an ERP system. If not, Excel is your ERP. Drones, only if the government and drones allow it. And private sector supply chains, on the other hand, are powered by advanced robotics, ERP, MRP, RFID, you name it, scanners, tools humanitarian logisticians dream of. Performance metrics. Humanitarian supply chains measure speed, coverage, and fairness. Private sector supply chains focus on cost efficiency and service level. Ethical imperative for humanitarian supply chains, ethics are central, rooted in humanitarian principles. For private sector supply chains, ethics are secondary, often framed as corporate responsibility. See what I mean? It's almost like comparing a rescue mission to a finely tuned orchestra, yeah? One's improvising in the middle of chaos, the others following a score. But here's the thing, both have something to teach each other. And isn't what makes this conversation so interesting? Let's step into the shoes of humanitarian legislation. Imagine the 2010 Haiti earthquake. In a matter of seconds, the world changed for millions. Roads and ports were destroyed, communication lines were down, the need for food, water, and medical supplies was immediate and overwhelming. How do you respond? Well, you do not have time to waste. Within just 48 hours, rapid assessment teams from the UN and all sorts of NGOs are already on the ground. They're using everything they can, satellite images, local reports, you name it, just to pinpoint the most urgent needs. The government of Haiti, with backup from the United Nations, World Bank, Inter American Development Bank, and the EU, kicks off the Post Disaster Needs Assessment or PDNA. This isn't just a quick check, it runs from February 18 to March 24. It was in 2010, and it's about more than just counting damage. It's about laying the groundwork for long term recovery. And the scope? It's huge. They look at 8 different sectors: governance, environment, disaster risk management, social sectors, infrastructure, production, macroeconomics, and cross cutting issues like youth, gender, and vulnerable groups. The data comes from satellite imagery, field surveys, and rapid building inspections. Over 400,000 buildings are assessed, and 600 Haitian engineers are trained up for the task. That's a massive coordinated effort in the middle of the chaos. Makes you appreciate just how much goes on behind the scenes, doesn't it? Let's talk about procurement. And honestly, it was a bit of a patchwork. Big international NGOs like the Red Cross, Oxfam, and World Vision learned heavily on prepositioning stocks and international supplies. Some groups had framework agreements in place so they could source supplies quickly, while others tried to buy locally whenever they could, yeah? So that wasn't always possible for some of the essential items. Meanwhile, the US military and UN agencies took charge of buying in bulk. Think food, medical supplies, shelter materials, often using emergency contracts to speed things up. But the challenges were real. Some local markets were either wiped out or just couldn't keep up. Customs clearance was painfully slow, with paperwork piling up at ports and airports. And because there wasn't a shared procurement platform, organizations sometimes ended up duplicating efforts or even competing for the same resources. It was a classic case of everyone trying to help, but sometimes stepping on each other's toes in the process. Let me paint you a picture. Haiti was often called the Republic of NGOs. Seriously, there were hundreds of organizations, all doing their own thing, often independently. You'd think with so many helpers, coordination would be a breeze, right? Well, not quite. Groups like the UN Logistic Cluster and the Cash Learning Partnership tried to get everyone on the same page, but here's the catch. A lot of NGOs prefer to go it alone, skipping the cluster coordination in favor of autonomy. Cash transfer programs eventually came along to help cut down on duplicate aid, but in those early days, coordination was pretty weak. What did that mean in practice? Overlapping initiatives, inconsistent standards, and a whole a lot of inefficiency when it came to procurement and distribution. Sometimes it felt like everyone was working hard, but not always working together. And let's be honest, coordination wasn't easy. There were some real gaps between the military and humanitarian folks. The military teams were laser focused on security and fixing up infrastructure, while NGOs were all about getting aid to people as quickly as possible. Then you had information silos. Everyone was keeping their own inventory list and transport schedules, but not really sharing. So sometimes nobody knew what was coming or going. Funding was another headache. Donors often tied their money to specific projects, which made it tough to be flexible when need changed on the ground. And don't forget the language and culture barriers. International staff and local authorities sometimes just didn't speak the same language, literally. All these issues added up to delays, duplicate shipments, and unfortunately, some remote communities not getting the help they desperately needed. It was a tough lesson in how important real collaboration and open communication can be. Now let's talk about transportation because getting supplies into Haiti after the earthquake was a whole adventure in itself. The ports and airports were in rough shape. Port-au-Prince, which usually handled almost all the imports, was basically out of commission. The backup ports like Cap Haitian and Jacmel were much smaller and not really set up for big relief operations. So, how did aid actually get in? Relief teams had to get creative. They used air operations to fly in urgent medical and food supplies. The US military ran impressive joint logistics over the shore operations, unloading cargo straight from ships, even when there weren't any working piers. Some supplies came overland from the Dominican Republic, but the roads were pretty rough, so that only helped so much. Private logistic companies like Loginix, along with military teams, played a huge role in moving literally millions of tons of supplies. It was a massive, coordinated effort, sometimes a little chaotic, but always determined to get help where it was needed the most. Now let's talk about the famous, actually infamous, last mile. Because honestly, this is where things got really tough. Damaged roads and security worries made deliveries slow and unpredictable. Aid hubs were set up near makeshift landing zones, which meant some isolated communities were left waiting, sometimes to wait too long. But there were some bright spots. For instance, World Vision rolled out LMMS, Last Mile Mobile Solution, which digitized beneficiary registration and actually cut distribution time in half. Pretty cool, right? Some NGOs also tried out cash for work programs and mobile money, And these aspects of humanitarian aid I will explain in our next podcast as well, so hit subscribe. Even with these innovations, bottlenecks stuck around. A lot of people in Haiti still face long waits for their essentials. The last mile really was the hardest mile. Okay, let's be real. The challenges in Haiti were everywhere you looked. Demand was unpredictable. One day it was food, the next day it was medicine, and you never really knew what was coming next. Infrastructure, damaged or just missing. Funding was always up in the air, with everyone hoping donors would come through. Coordinating between all the different groups, NGOs, military, local authorities was like herding cats. But here is what the humanitarian logisticians learned. Having supplies prepositioned and building strong partnership, especially with the military and private sector, makes a world of difference when you need to move fast. Centralized coordination and shared procurement systems? Absolutely essential. Otherwise, you end up with duplication and wasted effort. Investing in local capacity and planning ahead before disaster strikes pays off big time. Technology for tracking who gets what and keeping an eye on the supply chain helps cut through the chaos. And finally, strengthening civil military cooperation and making infrastructure more resilient isn't just nice to have, it's critical. It's a lot to juggle, but these lessons are what help turn chaos into coordinated actions when every minute counts. All right, let's switch gears and look at how the private sector handles supply chain challenges, especially a giant like Amazon. Picture this: the world goes into lockdown, and suddenly everyone wants their groceries, gadgets, and toilet paper and deliver it to their doorstep. Demand for home delivery absolutely explodes. So, what does Amazon do? They don't just sit back and hope for the best, they kick things into high gear. Amazon starts scaling up robotics, opening more fulfillment centers, and learning hard on predictive analytics to keep those shelves stocked. It's like watching a well oiled machine shift into overdrive. Here is the wild part: Amazon faced a 2-year surge in demand thanks to lockdown and everyone shopping online. Their supply chain optimization technologies team got to work using machine learning and AI forecast models to predict exactly what people would need, like sanitizers, masks, groceries, you name it. These models didn't just guess, they crunched real time buying pattern, tracked regional lockdowns, and dug into historical data. That way, Amazon could adjust their inventory and fulfillment strategies on the fly. The result? They could prioritize the hottest items and make sure stock was spread out across their global network, ready to meet demand wherever it popped up. Pretty impressive, right? It's a whole different world from the chaos of humanitarian logistics. But it's got its own kind of complexity and pressure. Okay, let's talk about how Amazon handled procurement during the pandemic. And honestly, it's a masterclass in flexibility. First, Amazon didn't put all its eggs in one basket. They diversified their sourcing, which means they didn't just rely on one country or one supplier. If a factory shut down in one place or a port clogged up in another place, they had backup options. They built relationships with suppliers all over the map and ramped up local sourcing to cut down on shipping delays. Inside their fulfillment centers, Amazon doubled down on automation and robotics. And this wasn't just about being high tech for the sake of it. It helped them keep things moving even when there were labor shortage and social distancing rules. And let's not forget they spent billions on PPE and safety gear for their workers. Plus, they set up their own internal COVID testing program. When it came to actually moving goods, flexibility was the name of the game. Amazon broadened its carrier base and brought in more third party logistics providers, those 3PLs you hear about, to make sure deliveries didn't grind to a halt. This shift towards using multiple carriers wasn't just an Amazon thing. It became a trend across the whole industry as companies realize they need more resilience in their supply chains. It's a great example of how thinking ahead and being willing to adapt can keep things running, even when the world turns upside down. Okay, do you want to hear how they coordinated with suppliers and handled all those moving parts next? Instead of just placing orders and hoping for the best, Amazon leaned into data driven transparency and joint planning. Basically, they used AI powered systems to keep a close eye on inventory levels and lead times. If something started running low or a shipment was delayed, they could spot it early and make adjustments before it became a crisis. But it wasn't just about the tech. Amazon shifted from treating suppliers like one off vendors to building real strategic partnership. They wanted relationships that could weather a storm, not just quick transactions. And by diversifying their supplier base, so they were not relying too much on any one region like China, they made their supply chain a lot more resilient. That moved that move turned out to be a lifesaver when the pandemic threw curveballs to a global trade. It's a great example of how collaboration, trust, and a little bit of smart technology can make all the difference when the pressure is on. Let's be real. Coordination was not always smooth sailing for Amazon either. Global shipping bottlenecks and port congestions became such a headache that Amazon actually started chartering its own ships and rerouting cargo through less crowded ports like Everett and Houston. Talk about taking matters into your own hands. Inside the warehouse, things got tricky too. Labor shortage and strict health protocols meant Amazon had to hire over 175,000 new workers, and it should be fast, and roll out a whole suite of safety measures just to keep things going. And even with all that planning and tech, there were still bumps in the road. Early in the pandemic, demand was so wild and supply networks were so fragmented that stockouts and delivery delays still happened. Sometimes even the best systems get overwhelmed when the world turns upside down. Let's talk about how Amazon kept things moving when transportation got tricky. To handle the surge, Amazon really expanded its middle mile network. They started chartering ships, added more air cargo capacity with Amazon Air, and used alternative ports to dodge the worst of the congestion. If one hub was jammed, they just reroute to another. Pretty clever, right? They also invested big in Amazon Freight and built out dynamic routing algorithm. With AI powered route optimization, they could minimize delays and quickly adapt to changing lockdowns or local restrictions. It's like having a GPS that not only knows the fastest route, but also predicts traffic jams before they happen. And here is something cool. Amazon didn't just focus on speed, they ramped up their sustainability efforts too. They committed $1 billion to decarbonize transportation and started rolling out electrical vehicles for last mile delivery. The goal? 100,000 EVs on the road by 2030. So not only were they delivering faster, but they were also working to deliver greener. It's a great example of how technology, flexibility, and a little bit of forward thinking can keep a supply chain running, even when the world is anything but predictable. Okay, let's summarize and break down what humanitarian aid may take from the private sector. Predictive analytics and AI? Absolutely essential. They help you see what's coming and adapt before things get out of hand. Imagine if humanitarian organizations could forecast demand spikes before a hurricane hits or anticipate bottlenecks in real time. That's the kind of power private sector tech brings to the table, diversifying suppliers and building real strategic partnerships. That's how you avoid getting stuck when one link in the chain breaks. In humanitarian aid, this could mean working with local businesses, international donors, and even commercial logistics firms to keep the flow of goods moving no matter what. Automation and robotics. They are lifesavers when you are short on people or need to keep things moving during a crisis. Think about drones delivering medicine to remote villages or automated inventory systems tracking every box of food in a disaster zone. Sustainability, electrifying delivery fleet and focusing on greener logistics isn't just good for planet, it actually makes your supply chain more resilient in the long run. Humanitarian organizations are starting to pilot powered cold chains and electrical vehicles inspired by the private sector innovations. But here is the catch: humanitarian contexts aren't Amazon. They need tech that's low cost, adaptable, and works in resource constrained environments. The dream is to transfer expertise in predictive analytics or even blockchain from private companies to humanitarian organizations. The impact could be transformative: faster responses, smarter decisions, lives saved. So maybe the real question is, how do we make that happen? How do we bridge the gap between these two worlds so that the lessons of one can empower the other? That's all for today's episode of the Humanitarian Supply Chain Podcast. I am Irina Lukyanova. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found the stories from humanitarian and private sectors insightful and thought provoking. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Your support helps us reach more listeners and keep these conversations going. Have a question or ideas for the future topics? Connect with me on social media or send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. For the next week, we will be exploring procurement procedures in humanitarian aid and the private sector. So stay tuned.